Hi, welcome back. Welcome to you too, Brad Watson from Avondale College of Higher Education. How are you?
Very good, thank you, Ken. Thanks for having me.
Now, Brad, you head up the Poverty and International Development Studies area at Avondale, is that right?
Yes, I do. It's a job I've been doing for about 10 years.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And the reason why I really wanted you to come in and talk to us today, Brad, is that a number of our viewers, and myself included, sponsor children. Now, you've done a fair bit of research in this area of child sponsorship. Who invented the idea?
Well, it seems that child sponsorship was invented in about 1919 after World War I.
Oh, wow, that early.
Yes. It looks like the Save the Children organisation was responsible. It was only newly formed then. Mm-hmm. And it occurred at a time when thousands of children in European countries were starving after the war.
What is the scale now of child sponsorship around the world?
Currently, depending on the estimates, we think there are between 8 and 12 million children who are sponsored. Mm-hmm. And we think it raises several $billion for developing countries. So it's a very important way of giving. World Vision by far is the largest child sponsor, and they estimate that they sponsor between 3 and 4 million children.
Boy, that's huge.
It's a lot.
And in Australia, Compassion is pretty big with child sponsorship.
It's one of the bigger ones, yes.
Yeah, Asian Aid, we've had some people from that organisation here. We've also had people supporting Compassion here in the studio. So, this is something that is close to a lot of people's hearts. Now, you've written a book. I know you didn't write every chapter, you edited it, and other experts wrote different chapters, but the book's about child sponsorship. Some people are concerned about that as an approach. Well, why would that be when it seems such a lovely thing to do?
Those criticisms come particularly from the 1970s and 80s, when some very large organisations were growing super fast. Some of their overhead expenses were up around 30 and 40% of the dollar that was going into their admin costs. And what some of those organisations were doing was making sure that the funding that did go to children was only benefiting the children. And so sometimes it wasn't benefiting the community or family members or other poor people surrounding that child. Another issue was that even up until the 1980s, the sponsorship of children in orphanages was still very common. And the big organisations began to realise that they had created orphan rushes. They'd built big, expensive orphanages. Often they weren't administrated as well as they could have been, and often they filled up with children who did have a mum or a dad or an uncle or somebody else in the family who would like to have taken care of the child. Unfortunately...
So this is situations where there's a poor family, they're struggling to look after their kids, and they say, well, I can't seem to get any help for my family, but I know my child can get help if they're considered an orphan, and they go to an orphanage because they're well supported by international donors.
And families were making that economic decision. If we lie about our child's status, we can get them a good future.
Wow.
But some of the big organisations began to say, look, it'd be better for us to help the family than to just take the child and put the child in a institution of sorts.
But some organisations choose not to sponsor children still.
Linking an individual to an individual can sometimes become more about the sponsor. And a lot of money can be siphoned off from the child to make sure that the sponsor receives letters and receives updates, and it can be an expensive way of supporting an individual child. Yes, and to some extent, a number of the leading sponsorship organisations are now doing fundraising with child sponsorship, but they're now also working with communities to benefit individual children rather than only helping out the individual. Look, I should say that I myself sponsor 3 children. And 2 of those children are individually sponsored. They go to a school, but their siblings do not. Their mothers are poor, but the mothers don't receive any help. And as a consequence of writing the book, and this is something I'd encourage all your viewers to think about, is would it be better where possible to assist the family as well as the child, or just to assist an individual child? And I personally am on a journey, I guess, where I'm tending to think it's better to help the family around the child.
The whole family. Wow, okay. Well, that's one practical tip that I guess we can take away from that. Brad, any more just as we finish off?
I think it is important to follow your heart to some extent. A lot of giving for us Christians is a spiritual decision.
Sure.
We have a sense of God's Spirit leading us, prodding our conscience to do something for others.
And it's very biblical as well, to help the widow and orphan in need.
Of course it is. And to some extent it is a personal and subjective choice. But one thing to consider is that the different sponsorship organisations go about doing their business differently. And so it's great to do a little bit of homework on who you're going to sign up to.
Sure.
I personally would go for an organisation that keeps less than 20% of the sponsorship dollar for its own
For overheads.
administrative costs. Some are much higher than that, and they disguise the true costs of it. And I personally would also suggest that you go for an organisation that looks at holistic child development. And that might mean that there's some spiritual benefits for the child in that, but perhaps it could be in their own cultural context rather than ours.
Wow, okay. Food for thought there. Boy, sometimes, giving's hard, isn't it? to give wisely.
It is hard, but it's also wonderful. And just to share a personal anecdote, my family have had the opportunity of travelling to India, and we have visited one of our sponsored children.
Oh, wow.
And I, on research with my students, visited one of our girls who was sponsored and was very humbled to have her wash my feet, as is her cultural custom. And all that time I thought I'd been blessing her, and there she was blessing me.
Boy,
so it is very touching, and it can be quite profound. Perhaps the last thing I would slip in is if I can, for 80 years, since the earliest sponsorship programs, sponsored children have been saying, letters are really important to us. Don't just sponsor us, communicate with us. You guys are almost like a god. You're like a dad. You're like a mum. When the money comes in year after year, without any communication attached to that, it is confusing for them. You may underestimate it, but they certainly don't, and it can be really treasured. So look after that relationship if you sponsor a child.
Wow, touche. That's something for me to think about, that's for sure. Thanks so much for your time, Brad. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
We'll be back straight after the break.